Amid the ordinary hum of a bustling supermarket, a decorated army officer and an arrogant police officer find themselves on a collision course that will test courage, integrity, and the true meaning of duty. What begins as a small act of carelessness spirals into a life-altering moment where calm resolve faces unwarranted aggression. Stay tuned for a tale of bravery, redemption, and a twist you'll never forget. Colonel Laura Obama strolled through the bustling supermarket aisles, the faint hum of chatter and the occasional squeak of cartwheels filling the air. She wore a simple outfit, jeans, and a comfortable sweater, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But there was something about her presence, a quiet confidence that came from years of leading soldiers and making tough decisions under pressure. She wasn't just another shopper. She was someone who carried authority like a second skin. As Laura compared two brands of cereal, a loud crash echoed from a nearby aisle. Heads turned briefly, but the crowd quickly returned to their business. Laura decided to investigate. Turning the corner, she saw the culprit. A shattered glass jar oozing marinara sauce across the tiled floor. Officer Scott Williams, a tall man with a cocky smirk and a swagger in his step, was already walking away from the scene, hands casually stuffed into his jacket pockets. Laura frowned. She couldn't believe someone could be so careless and so indifferent. It wasn't just the mess. It was the complete disregard for the inconvenience it caused others. Shaking her head, she pushed her cart forward and called out, her voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, sir," she said. Scott stopped, turning around lazily. His eyes met hers with a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "Yeah, you dropped that jar," Laura said, gesturing toward the mess. "You should inform an employee and help clean it up." Scott let out a short laugh, more of a scoff than anything else. "What are you, the jar police?" he said, rolling his eyes. He turned as if to walk away again. Laura's gaze hardened. "No, I'm someone who believes in taking responsibility for their actions," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "You made the mess. The least you can do is own up to it." Scott turned back, his smirk deepening into a mocking grin. "Lady, it's just a jar of sauce. They have people for that, you know. Why don't you go back to shopping and let them do their job?" A few shoppers paused in their tracks, sensing the tension. Laura stood her ground, her eyes unwavering as she met Scott's dismissive gaze. Her voice remained composed, but there was an edge to it now. "It's not about the jar. It's about respect. For the staff, for the people walking here who might slip, and for yourself. Do the right thing." Scott's amusement disappeared, replaced by a look of irritation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked, puffing up his chest. "I'm a police officer. I don't need a lecture from some nosy shopper." Laura raised an eyebrow. "And I'm a colonel in the United States Army," she said, her voice quiet but carrying undeniable authority. "I don't care who you are. You still have a responsibility to act with decency." Scott was momentarily caught off guard, his expression faltering before he quickly masked it with bravado. "Well, Colonel," he said, sarcasm dripping from his voice, "you can take your Army rules somewhere else. I don't take orders from you." Laura didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood tall, her calm presence filling the aisle. "It's not about orders. It's about integrity. But clearly, you've forgotten what that means." The standoff left the air heavy with tension. Shoppers whispered among themselves, glancing between Laura and Scott, unsure how this encounter would end. Scott's jaw clenched as he glared at Laura, but she didn't look away, her unwavering gaze daring him to rise above his arrogance. For a moment, the silence stretched, and then Scott sneered, muttering something under his breath as he turned on his heel and stormed off. Laura sighed, her expression softening as she turned to a nearby store employee. "There's a spill in aisle 4, she said, her tone returning to its calm, professional cadence. "Be careful. It's glass and sauce." The employee nodded, hurrying off to handle the situation. As Laura returned to her cart, she couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. It wasn't about winning or losing an argument. It was about standing up for what was right. And as she moved on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't quite over. The supermarket aisle, once filled with mundane chatter and the clinking of shopping carts, grew uncomfortably quiet. Shoppers began to slow their movements, their attention drawn to the heated exchange between Laura and Officer Scott. Some whispered among themselves, others pretended to browse nearby shelves, while keeping a cautious eye on the scene. Laura remained calm, her voice steady and unwavering. "This isn't about you or me. It's about doing the right thing," she said, her tone cutting through the awkward tension like a blade. Scott, however, wasn't having it. His face flushed with anger, and he raised his voice. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he snapped, the sound echoing down the aisle. "What, are you trying to embarrass me? Is that it?" Laura didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to embarrass you," she replied, her words deliberate and measured. "But your attitude is a problem. Responsibility matters, especially for someone in your position." The subtle jab struck a nerve. Scott's pride, already wounded by being called out in public, crumbled into a mess of rage and defensiveness. He stepped closer, towering over Laura in an attempt to intimidate her. "You don't know me, lady," he growled. "You don't get to lecture me. Back off before you regret it." Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered at the edges of the confrontation. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they should intervene or call for help. Laura, however, stood her ground. Her training had prepared her for moments like this, moments where fear or doubt might overwhelm an ordinary person. She was anything but ordinary. Her eyes locked on Scott's, cold and resolute. "I've faced tougher men than you on battlefields," she said, her voice low but filled with unmistakable authority. "You don't scare me." For a moment, Scott hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. But his bruised ego quickly surged back to the surface, pushing him to escalate further. "You think you're better than me because you wear a uniform," he shouted. "You're just." The rest of his sentence was drowned out by a scream. Without warning, Scott's hand shot to his belt, and he pulled a handgun. The shiny black barrel gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he leveled it at Laura. Shoppers screamed and ducked, abandoning carts and scattering like startled birds. Some dropped to the floor, while others bolted for the exits. Laura didn't move. Her heartbeat quickened, but her expression remained calm. She held her hands slightly out to the sides, palms facing forward, her every movement deliberate. "Put the gun down, officer," she said firmly, her tone commanding without a trace of panic. "Don't tell me what to do." Scott barked, his hands trembling slightly as he held the weapon. His bravado was cracking under the weight of the moment, his voice rising with desperation. "I'm in charge here." "You're not in charge of anything," Laura replied evenly. "Right now, you're a danger to everyone in this store. Put the gun down before someone gets hurt." The tension in the air was suffocating. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Shoppers huddled behind shelves and displays, holding their breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. Scott's knuckles whitened around the grip of his gun. His pride and rage waged a battle against the part of him that knew he was spiraling out of control. And standing before him was Laura, unyielding, her presence like a mirror reflecting his every flaw. "Don't make this worse for yourself," Laura said, her voice softening just enough to show she wasn't his enemy. "It's not too late to fix this." Scott's eyes darted around, his expression a storm of confusion, anger, and fear. But the moment teetered on a knife's edge, and it wasn't clear which way it would fall. The aisle was deathly quiet except for the shallow breathing of those hiding nearby. Laura stood motionless, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of calm and surrender. The cold barrel of Scott's gun was trained on her chest, but her eyes remained fixed on his, steady and unyielding. "You're a police officer," Laura said softly, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "You swore an oath to protect, not to harm. Look at yourself. Is this who you want to be?" Scott's hands wavered, the gun trembling slightly in his grip. He didn't answer, but his eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape from the mounting weight of his actions. "Everyone's watching," Laura continued, her tone unshakable. "This is your chance to show them what kind of man you are. A protector, a leader, someone who does the right thing, even when it's hard." Scott's expression twisted with conflict, his pride battling against the truth in her words. His lips parted as if to respond, but before he could speak, a small voice broke the tension. "Uncle Scott, please don't hurt her." A boy, no older than 7, stepped hesitantly into the aisle from behind a cereal shelf. His large brown eyes were wide with fear and innocence, his small hands clutching the hem of his jacket. He looked up at Scott, his voice trembling but brave. "Mom says you're a hero," the boy said softly. "But heroes don't point guns at people." Scott froze, his face paling as if the boy's words had struck him harder than any physical blow. "Timmy," he muttered, his voice cracking, "go back to your mom. Now." Timmy didn't move. His gaze flicked to Laura, who gave him a subtle nod, her expression warm and reassuring. Then, just as quickly, the piercing wail of sirens filled the air. The distant sound grew louder, closer, until the flash of red and blue lights illuminated the store's front windows. The entrance doors burst open, and uniformed police officers stormed inside, their weapons drawn. A commanding voice boomed across the supermarket. "Drop your weapon. Now." Scott spun to face the incoming officers, his gun still in his hand. Panic flashed across his face as he raised his arms slightly, the firearm dangling from his fingers. One of the officers, a grizzled sergeant with a stern expression, froze mid-step as his eyes landed on Laura. "Colonel Obama," the sergeant exclaimed, lowering his weapon immediately. "What's going on here?" Laura didn't waver. "Sergeant, your man has lost control," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Disarm him before someone gets hurt." The sergeant nodded sharply, motioning to 2 officers, who approached Scott cautiously. "Scott, hand me the weapon," the sergeant ordered. His tone carried no room for argument. Scott hesitated for a moment before slowly handing over the gun. The sergeant's face hardened as he holstered the weapon and turned to the trembling officer. "Williams, you've disgraced the badge," he said coldly. "Effective immediately. You're relieved of duty." Before Scott could respond, the officers began removing his badge and service belt. The small crowd of shoppers, many of whom had remained hidden, began to emerge cautiously, whispering among themselves. Scott stood there, stripped of his authority, his face a mask of humiliation and disbelief. Timmy watched the scene silently, his small hands clasped together. Laura stepped forward, kneeling to meet the boy's eye level. "You were very brave, Timmy," she said softly. "You helped make everything better." The boy nodded, his lips quivering as he glanced at his uncle, who stood silent and defeated. Laura placed a gentle hand on his shoulder before standing to address the sergeant. "Thank you for handling this quickly," she said. The sergeant nodded, his expression serious. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this, Colonel. We'll take it from here." As Scott was escorted out in handcuffs, Laura glanced at the shattered glass and the small pool of sauce still on the floor. It was a reminder of how something so small could escalate into something so dangerous, and how courage and composure could diffuse even the worst situations. Laura took a deep breath, then turned to Timmy and smiled. "Let's find your mom," she said. Together, they walked toward the store's exit, leaving the chaos behind. The sound of murmurs filled the supermarket as Officer Scott Williams, now handcuffed, was led past the lingering crowd by 2 officers. His face was a mixture of shame and regret. He glanced around at the onlookers, some whispering, others shaking their heads in disapproval. The weight of their judgment pressed heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, he truly grasped the consequences of his actions. As he neared the exit, his eyes met Laura's. She stood tall and composed, her expression a blend of pity and disappointment. She didn't say a word, but her steady gaze seemed to convey everything. "You're better than this. You could have been better than this." Scott's head lowered, and he broke the eye contact, his once proud demeanor replaced by a hollow shell of the man who had walked into the store earlier. The store manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a clipboard in hand, approached Laura with a grateful smile. "Colonel Obama, I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You kept everyone safe today. That took real courage." "It's not about courage," Laura replied humbly, brushing off the praise. "It's about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is." One of the shoppers, a woman clutching her toddler, stepped forward. "You were amazing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't even flinch when he pulled that gun. Thank you for protecting us." A few others chimed in with words of gratitude and admiration. Laura nodded politely, offering a reassuring smile to each of them. She wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but she understood the importance of standing up in moments like these, not for recognition, but because it was necessary. As Scott was escorted out the door, the sergeant turned back to Laura. "We'll make sure he faces the consequences," he assured her. "And thank you for keeping this from becoming worse than it already was." Laura gave a small nod. "Take care of him," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He's lost his way, but that doesn't mean he can't find it again." Later that evening, Laura drove home with her young nephew, Timmy, sitting quietly in the passenger seat. The fading sunlight cast a golden glow over the city streets, and for a while, the two rode in reflective silence. Timmy finally broke the quiet, his small voice tentative. "Aunt Laura." "Yes, Timmy," she replied, glancing at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. "Were you scared?" he asked, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "When he pointed the gun at you?" Laura smiled gently, her voice calm and steady. "A little," she admitted. "It's okay to feel scared, but what's important is not letting fear stop you from doing what's right." Timmy nodded slowly, his young mind processing her words. "I didn't know what to do," he said after a moment. "But when I saw you being so brave, I felt like I had to try." Laura's heart swelled with pride. She reached over, giving his shoulder a comforting squeeze. "You did the right thing, Timmy." You reminded him of who he should be. That took courage. Timmy smiled shyly, the weight of the day beginning to lift. Laura's mind wandered as the quiet hum of the car filled the space between them. She thought about the importance of standing up to arrogance and aggression, of remaining calm and composed even when the odds felt insurmountable. It wasn't just about today's events. It was about setting an example for the next generation. When they reached home, Laura took a moment before stepping out of the car. She looked at Timmy, her voice filled with warmth. "Remember, Timmy, bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are." Timmy nodded solemnly, as though filing her words away for later. Together, they stepped into the house, the night closing in behind them, a reminder that, no matter how dark things might seem, light could always be found through courage and conviction. Thank you for watching and being part of our story. Don't leave without subscribing, and endeavor to like and share to your community. It's a small click that makes a big difference. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to connect with you. Your subscription inspires us to bring you even more unforgettable tales. Stay tuned for our next story. You won't want to miss it.